going to make a few announcements. Good midday. My kids say, is it midday yet? It's now midday. My name is Hadar Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law here at the Law School. We are happy to see you all here and in our second installment of Munching on Human Rights for this semester. We will have one more in November that's going to focus on the law of armed conflict, meaning, are there rules of war? Yes, in fact, there are. And so we will be discussing a very quick view of a very complicated body of law, and we urge you to join us for that in the beginning of November. I don't remember the exact date. Do you remember the date? 9th, November 9th. So, a few more upcoming events, because it would not be the center if I did not have an entire slew of beautifully arranged flyers for you of events that are upcoming. On Thursday night, we have the next screening of the 12th Annual Human Rights Film Series. Have any of you been to the other two? Last week was How to Die in Oregon. The week before that was the eco-terrorist movie, the Tree Falls, right? This Thursday night at the Katzen Center is a film called The Redemption of General Butt Naked. I know that this is going to be one that lots of people are going to want to go to, not because they know what it's about, just because the name. The truth is, the story is one that is quite relevant to our community, as one that is focused on the elimination and the prevention of egregious human rights abuses and war crimes. It's a film about the Liberian Civil War and a general who participated in really bad things and has now redeemed himself, or at least is trying to, and it is his story. His nom de guerre was General Butt Naked. He's now an evangelical minister. And so the screening will take place at 5:30 on Thursday afternoon at the Katzen Art Center up the hill, that weird round building with the pink sculptures outside of it. And we would encourage you to come. There'll be a discussion after the film about the themes of the film, as there is each week with the film series screening. On Wednesday, October 12th, this Wednesday at 12 o'clock in the JD Lounge, our program on human trafficking and forced labor will be having a lunch discussion on human trafficking, prostitution, pandemics, and politics. Do anti-trafficking policies actually hurt the most vulnerable? It should be a very interesting discussion with Joanna Buza, who's a senior lecturer in sexual and reproductive health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and our own Ann Jordan, who is the director of our program on human trafficking. On Monday, October 17th at noon in the JD Student Lounge, we will be having the first, again, in a series of controversial conversations in human rights. This series gives you a chance to talk about, respectfully, with a set of ground rules, a controversial question in the sphere of human rights. And in honor and in connection with Immigrants' Rights Week, the first in this series is the question, who deserves asylum? So we hope that you will come and bring your views and bring your ideas. This is a chance for you all to talk rather than listening to the rest of us talk about these kinds of questions. Finally, on Tuesday, October 18th, we'll be having an event. I know you're loving this, huh? On Tuesday, October 18th, we'll be having a lunchtime panel discussion of 40 years after the Attica prison uprising. Our own Professor Herman Schwartz was one of the first intermediaries in the Attica uprising, which took place 40 years ago in Attica, New York. And he was extremely involved in litigation and advocacy on behalf of prisoners' rights. He is going to speak, as well as Professor Ira Robbins, who's a noted authority in the field of prison reform. And that will be taking place at noon in room 603 on Tuesday, October 18th. All of this information can be found at the Center's listserv, which you should sign up for if you haven't already, on the Center's website, through the section reps who make announcements, and at our various events where I will stand up and make announcements. One last thing before I introduce Professor Wilson. I would like to introduce Cecily Thompson-Williams, the Center's new Assistant Director, as well as, where is she? She's outside, Melissa De La Aguila, our Program Coordinator. These are names and faces that will become very familiar to all of you. They are our teammates over at the center. They help to make all of this happen. And so we are grateful to them every day. I am grateful to them every day for their partnership and their hard work. With all of that said, I am also grateful to Professor Rick Wilson, who is a co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. He's also the director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic here at WCL. And he is our munching on human rights partner in crime, I would say, for all these years. He has presented cases in front of the Inter-American Commission and Court of Human Rights. Among his various claims to fame were defending and continuing to defend detainees in Guantanamo, as well as doing very important work on behalf of the European Union in trying to overturn the death penalty in the United States. His resume goes on and on and on. However, the most important thing is that he is also an expert in and very committed to the field of economic, social, and cultural rights, which is the topic of discussion today. For those of you who are with us for the first Munching on Human Rights, in 60 minutes we gave you a full overview of the entire human rights system. It was just breathtaking. It took my breath away since I was doing it. Today we get to dig deeper into a specific sphere with Professor Wilson, who's going to talk about economic and social rights. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Pilar. I think there's a comment going on next door. How many of you are first-year students? How many are LLM students? You may be it. And the rest of you, we have a small human rights clinic contingent up in the corner, and then Andrew here in the middle. I'm pleased to see the students from my human rights clinic here in attendance today. And today I'm going to focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently than I've done before. I'm going to start with some hypos. That's what law professors do. But first question is, what are economic, social, and cultural rights? Give me an example. Anybody? Yes?
The right to work, to health care, to education.
Work, health care, education. You have another example?
The right to remain within the First Amendment of the U.S.
I'm sorry?
The first, what we take from the U.S. First Amendment rights, free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion.
That's not in the constellation of economic, social, and cultural rights. Those are civil and political rights. Classic examples of civil and political rights. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what's the difference between those two. Other examples of economic, social, and cultural rights? There's one on the board. Yeah.
To raise your family within your own tribal group.
Raise your family within your own, so indigenous rights, cultural rights, cultural recognition. It's a small piece of that in the treaty sense, in the sense of the treaty, but it's a very big topic in international law today. Do you have another example?
I was going to say freedom to follow whatever faith you want.
Following faith,
As long as it doesn't hurt other people.
to the extent that it gets incorporated into this sort of culture, this issue about culture, yes. Oftentimes, though, freedom of religion would be associated with what we would call the First Amendment rights. The civil and political covenant would include freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, all of the freedoms from state intervening to keep you from doing what you want to do. But enjoying traditional cultural practices in religion might very well be part of it. And you can see already that we begin to see kind of a ebb and flow between the two bodies of rights. Yes?
I don't know if it was that right to housing.
Housing? Absolutely. Okay. Yes?
Well, the right to work, to provide housing and food, everything that you and your family need.
Work, housing, food, everything your family needs.
Necessities.
Necessities. Necessities. Okay. So let's take a look at this provision right here, Article 11, which is right where you were looking. This issue in the very first clause. This is from the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So, and this is Article 11. The states parties, those of you in the back who can't see the small print, to the present covenant recognize the right to everyone to an adequate standard of living. Standard of living for himself and his family. So there was some invocation of family over here. Maybe family comes into play. Including adequate food, clothing, and housing. Not shelter, but housing. And the continuous improvement of living conditions. The states parties will take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this right, recognizing to this effect the essential importance of international cooperation based on free consent. There is a subsection 2 of that article, which we may take up in a moment, but that, remarkably, is the only place in this treaty that you will see the mention of the terms of art that you have invoked. Housing, food, clothing, all subsumed under this notion of standard of living. So let's take a simple right. The right to food. The right to food. We're all having lunch. A free one, right? What about the kids in DC schools? Do they have a right to food?
I guess if everyone would have a right to food, it would be, the controversy would be whether it should be included within perhaps like the school system providing it, or who would be responsible for making that available.
Okay. Anybody know what the DC schools do? About food?
Well, I'm
Yeah.
assuming they have like a reduced meal plan and a free meal plan for those who need it.
They do, in fact.
Most schools do.
So, reduced fees, free meals for kids. How much? What kind? We talking Mickey D's here? We talking nutritious food? What kind of food are they getting?
I'm sure it's pretty cheap.
Pretty cheap. Yeah.
But then that also probably goes to a debate about what actually constitutes food.
Yeah. What is food? What counts as food? Well, I just happened to have a conversation this morning with one of the staff people in the clinic who dropped off her, I think, son, who is about 4, in Head Start in D.C., and he gets breakfast, a fairly nutritious breakfast. He gets lunch if he needs it, and the parents fill out a form that says, we are in need, we need some help, we don't need any help. The most you pay for lunch, if you are a non-needy parent, is $3.10 a day to get your child lunch. The breakfasts are free, and any kid eats, and she said it doesn't matter when the kids show up, they get fed. If they're late for breakfast, they take them to breakfast first. And it brings to mind a conversation between an African diplomat and an American diplomat who were debating the relative importance of economic, social, and cultural rights compared to civil and political rights. The American, of course, was arguing that civil and political rights are the first thing we have to have for a structured society, a structured, organized society. They come first. And the African diplomat responded, first let's have breakfast. Then we'll talk about civil and political rights. And the answer was, you've got to eat. You've got to eat first. You've got to eat before you can talk about anything else. Now, you could debate about whether or not you've got to have housing before you can do anything else, whether you've got to have education, you've got to have work, you've got to have these other basic economic, social, and cultural rights. And that is a very vibrant debate that's going on. And in the West, we have tended to privilege civil and political rights. In the former Soviet Union, it used to be an East-West issue, now it's kind of a North-South issue. There was the sort of privileging of economic, social, and cultural rights first, on the idea that the socialist system would provide those basic necessities for everyone, and then they would deal with civil and political rights later. But first, the necessities. So there is definitely a political, historical dimension to these two bodies of law. And as Adar talked about, I assume, when you were talking about the sort of big picture of human rights, these two treaties, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, broke apart so that the document that she was handing out, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, has them together in one document. They break into two treaties and very much become different regimes with different enforcement mechanisms and different ways of being interpreted, different ways of vindicating the rights. But just to tease this out a little bit more, let me extend the hypothetical a little bit. Let's assume we have a country. Let's take Haiti. Haiti gets hit by a giant hurricane. Everything is destroyed. Infrastructure, buildings, food supplies. What does someone in Haiti do to argue about their right to food? What do they say? What are their arguments? Their lawyers, give me a legal argument. There it is. Let's assume Haiti is a party to this convention. Right there it says they have a right to food. Where do they go?
The other parties of the convention?
Other articles of the convention?
The other parties to the convention.
The other parties? So pretty much not going to happen inside of Haiti? You're giving up on Haiti already? You're going to go to, how about the Haitian judiciary? Can't they enforce the right? It's in the treaty. Don't treaties have meaning? Don't they have, can't we use them? Yeah. Let's not. Those are niceties. Let's assume it's all been incorporated into domestic law. Yes, back in the back.
Well, they can try and sue the government, but if there is no food, there is no food.
There's no food. There's no food. So it's a right that would be very difficult to vindicate because there just isn't any food to be had. Did you have a potential answer?
Along the same lines, I would think they'd have to go outside of Haiti because they'd have to get a judgment from a body to which the other parties of the treaty would respect. So, like, if they just went and got a judgment from a Haitian court, I wouldn't think that other parties to the treaty would be bound to follow that judgment.
Yeah, you're getting into issues about how multilateral treaties might create obligations for parties, and this is maybe a variation of your response about, I think it was yours, about maybe other states have some responsibility. So, and that's kind of where you're leaning. It's something about somebody's got to come to help out. Somebody's got to help them out.
But doesn't the article create a responsibility? The responsibility for the state of Haiti to take care of its own citizens, does it create a responsibility for other states to take care of Haiti's citizens?
Absolutely. So the response was, well, I'm paraphrasing. First, it's Haiti's responsibility to take care of Haitians. The notion of sovereignty, the notion of traditional recognition of territorial integrity and the right of a country to make its own decisions about its own people come into play here, and we want to say, hey, Haiti has to take care of the Haitians. So that's their job first. They have to figure out a way to provide food. But if they don't have it, they're going to probably have to go somewhere else to look for it. And they're going to have to rely on some notion of international cooperation. And if you look at this subsection 2, it does talk about these programs for both internal production, conservation, and distribution of food. So Haiti should have some conservation methods and distribution methods that save some food somewhere so that in case there's a national emergency, they have the means to feed people. But if they don't, maybe they have help from other countries. International cooperation, even in the first provision. Let's say we are not talking about Haiti, but we're talking about the United States today in a bad economy. And we have some folks without documents here. What are their rights to food? These are people who are from other countries in the United States, bad economy, no jobs, a lot of unemployed. Sound familiar? And we've got people who are from outside of the United States who are here. Any obligation to provide them with food? Yeah.
Well, that says everyone, not citizens.
Says everyone. Does everyone mean everyone? Does it say citizens? Does it say nationals? No. It says everyone. Now that doesn't make a lot of folks very happy, and it's one of the reasons why the United States hasn't ratified this treaty, because those are some of the implications. We have to take care of everyone who is here if we undertake these obligations. And a country that is affluent has that responsibility not just to itself, but to other countries as well. So, if we go back to our Haiti example and we talk about the United States, is the United States fulfilling the right to food if they export big truckloads of KFC and Pizza Hut and McDonald's to Haiti to feed the Haitian people? Are they fulfilling their treaty obligations? It's food. Let's not quibble. I don't know. Everybody's puzzled. Is it food? I don't know. You guys eat it? I do every once in a while. It's great comfort food. Yeah.
I would say it would more depend on what your definition of adequate is.
Yeah. Adequate food or nutritious food. Yeah. Yeah. And I would guess that, and I know there is in fact interpretive comments to this treaty that talk about what is food, what is nutritious food, what is the minimum caloric content of food. But does this discussion feel different than the kind of discussion we have around an issue like torture? Yeah, it does to me. I mean, if Haiti were torturing people, can we turn to the courts to make them stop? We would hope we could. We would hope the police wouldn't do it. The police would stop it. The courts would enforce the right, stop the torture, and it would end. And you would have a remedy. Habeas corpus, any number of other remedies. But when we talk about these rights, these economic, social, and cultural rights, they are much harder to give shape to and much harder to define. They are positive obligations of the state. They involve taking some steps, and they oftentimes, in between the North and the South, involve the North's obligation to do something for the South to contribute to making the situation better, which takes us into the field of development, foreign assistance, obligations to undertake foreign aid, to provide this kind of assistance, which is covered in the treaty, but gosh, it takes us back to this gentleman's comment about what did states sign on to? Do the other states agree by signing this treaty that they're going to help out Haiti when there's a hurricane? Is there some treaty provision here that says that the United States, if it were a party, has an obligation to help out Haiti? Maybe not here. There is a general provision of the treaty back here. Article 2. Article 2 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is the provision about how it takes shape, how it gets enforced, how it's acted on. So, and I'll read this just for the small print. Each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take steps individually and through international assistance. Now, it doesn't say the U.S. has an obligation if it's signed on, but international assistance is part of this, and cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant by all appropriate means, including the adoption of legislative measures. Wow. See any qualifiers there? How many are there? How many qualifiers are there? Things that allow you to kind of slide away from your obligation. Come on, treaty readers. Give me an example. Anyone, yeah?
Appropriate means?
Appropriate means, what's appropriate?
Take steps.
Take steps. Well, take steps doesn't say do it now. It says
Take steps.
take steps, yeah.
Available resources.
Available resources. And we don't have the resources. Progressively. Is that where you're going? Okay. This first provision of Article 2 is fraught with qualifications. You will find nothing like this in the Civil and Political Covenant. Civil and Political Covenant basically says, do it now, got to be done, right away. It's an obligation, right now. Why is this qualified like this? Why all these qualifications? Don't all people need food, shelter, employment, education?
It costs a lot of money, sir.
It does. It does. It costs a lot of money. So, the obligations cost money, and that's one of the biggest arguments that comes up against the implementation of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant. It costs money. The Civil and Political Covenant, all the government has to do is get out of the way, let you speak, let you celebrate your religion. So the argument goes, Civil and Political Covenant is negative rights. State gets out of the way, doesn't do anything. Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant, positive rights. Rights that the state actually has to do something and spend some money in order to realize the right. It has to spend money. Is that analogy or is that analysis correct? Are civil and political rights free? think of a civil and political right that might cost a little money for the state?
Of course.
What was that?
Of course.
Courts.
No, of course. Of course, sure.
Of course. Courts. That's what I thought you said. I'm going with courts. Courts cost a lot of money. Courts cost a huge amount of money, and are they all in the civil and political covenant? Yep, that's where they are. What else costs money? Civil and political side, yes?
Election.
Elections. Oh my God. They are really getting pricey. Really pricey, especially when the lawyers have been involved in every election fight and you start paying the lawyers in the big firm. It gets really pricey.
Well, pretty much the entire criminal system, from police to jails.
Absolutely. All law enforcement associated with civil and political rights also comes into play when you're talking about free speech, right? And we have to, certainly in the Capitol, we have to have police around to make sure we don't have protesters that get a little carried away, start trashing buildings. We gotta have free speech, but we gotta control it. We gotta have a system to control civil and political rights. So civil and political rights are not all negative. And one could argue that economic, social, and cultural rights are not all positive either. The right to work may not involve the state at all. It may be that the state can play a role in making work available, but somebody getting a job may be able to do that entirely within the private sector with the state not getting in the way, not setting up laws that prevent the person from getting the job, not barring unionization, for example, not barring the ability to organize, a right associated with the right of association in the civil and political covenant. So these rights flow back and forth. I think it's a fallacy to suggest that one set of rights is positive and the other is negative. I think they both entail positive and negative obligations. But these rights, I think, get more complicated in part because they are more expensive, and in part because we tend to think of them collectively rather than individually. So the individual, when we talk about the torture example, people get tortured, and that person has a claim for the torture. Haiti getting blown to the ground gives rise to a right to food for its entire population, but how does the whole population invoke the right? How does the collective of Haiti go to court to enforce its right to food? It is or could be a collective right as well as an individual right. So the collectivity of it may also contribute to the difficulty in its realization. And it is surprising how much we tend to think about what lawyers do in court in terms of individuals. And as soon as we go beyond the individual to the class, in a class action in the United States or other devices like it, in international systems, group complaints or complaints filed on behalf of an NGO or an organization that has large membership, we start sort of testing the boundaries about how we're going to define this collective. Where are we going to say its limits are? And if there is relief to be given, if you come to the end and you have a court decision that says, yes, the right has been violated and reparations will be what? Who shares the money? Who shares the decision in the outcome of the decision about how you're going to decide what reparations are? Now, there actually has been a rich jurisprudence in the inter-American system and other human rights systems about those very questions. I think much richer than the case law in the United States, where class action work has taken shape largely around, I mean, think of the big class actions in your lifetimes. Tobacco, asbestos, others? Walmart, yeah. I mean, and that's a good example. The decision from this spring from the Supreme Court about the group of women in Walmart. Even that group is too big to be able to manage in the legal system, so says the Supreme Court, in terms of standing. Standing and procedural rules make all kinds of problems for lawyers when we start invoking these group rights, like the right to food. And yet we started with a hypothetical about the United States and its obligations to feed kids in the school system. Well, we don't have a right, but the U.S. has spent a lot of money to provide food for kids in schools. So in a sense, without having signed the treaty that says we have an obligation to feed everyone, we've taken on the obligation. What happens, and what troubles lawyers, and certainly troubles me, is what if they decide tomorrow to take away the food program? Was that potentially in play in the budget debates? You betcha. Are there certain contingents of our political spectrum that would love to eliminate food for kids in schools? Brutal as it may be? Absolutely. Big government spends too much money. Get rid of it. Needless spending. Eliminate it. And if you eliminated it, took it out of the budget, where would the kids go? Could they invoke their right to food? Could they go to court and say, Head Start fed me. You have to keep feeding me. Is there a constitutional right to food in the United States? Would you find it anywhere? Any of you taken common law? Did you read that provision about the right to food? No. In the Bill of Rights? Nowhere. Are any of the economic, social, and cultural rights in the Bill of Rights? Nowhere. And yet, what is the biggest public debate we are having in the United States right now? Jobs. Education. Health. They're political debates, not legal debates. They're debates about what we ought to do. What we ought to do. And the trouble with being on the side of arguing in their favor is they usually flow, most importantly, to the poorest population. We all have food. We all have shelter, housing. We're affluent law students and law professors. But there are an awful lot of people who don't. Those are the people who are making the plea for protection of their rights. The people who are non-citizens, immigrants, women, children, minorities are the most affected by the absence of these rights. And they're the most vulnerable populations when it comes to going to court. And the track record of the United States in finding or reading into the Constitution economic, social, and cultural rights is pretty slim. There are a few decisions about education, the right to education under the Constitution, saying you can't deprive kids who are non-documented in certain school systems from having less access to education than others. Those are rare decisions. Rare decisions. So it's not surprising that these are not the primary rights that we talk about in the United States. They are very much at the top of the agenda in other countries. So let's take a few minutes and look at the bigger picture. Let's step back from the specifics of this and those hypotheticals and look at this picture of the two treaties. And when I teach economic, social, and cultural rights, I use this covenant as my sort sort of launching point, my touchstone, if you will, for where we're going to launch into discussion of it, because there are many countries that don't have something like this in their domestic law, like the United States. So we have to look at the treaty. We have to look at the treaty and the obligations it may or may not create. So when we back out to look at the civil and political covenant versus the social, economic, and cultural covenant, what's the big picture look like? Well, there are 160 states that have signed and ratified this covenant. There are 167, just a tad more, who have ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as of yesterday. So it's pretty equal. Can you guess which countries, I've already told you one, haven't ratified this one? North Korea. That's probably a pretty good guess. United States, definitely. How about civil and political? What's the most prominent country that hasn't ratified the civil and political covenant? China. China. And here we are. It's East and West again. It is maybe socialism versus capitalism, but is China socialist anymore? I don't know. Socialist in political structure. Its economy, a lot of folks would say, profoundly capitalist and moving at great speed. But those are emblematic, I think, of the differences between the two treaties and the countries that have adopted them or not. Both of these covenants have what are called optional protocols. Those are additional treaties that are added on afterwards. States have to agree to, it's just like another treaty. You have to agree to sign it and to join the regime. The fact that you ratified this one doesn't mean you're ratifying the optional protocol, but it helps to be a party to this treaty in order to sign on to the optional protocol. Now, the United States doesn't necessarily honor that. It signed some optional protocols where it hasn't signed the treaty, as in the case of the Children's Convention. But in these situations, we have optional protocols that allow individual complaints. They allow an individual affected by a violation of these treaties in the country where the violation takes place, if the country has ratified the treaty, to complain about the failure of this country to live up to its obligations under the treaty. So, somebody in Haiti may have a claim that Haiti has ratified this treaty under the optional protocol, and Haiti has ratified the optional protocol, to complain against Haiti for failure to provide the right to food. The domestic system can't provide it. There is an option to complain about it in the UN system under this optional protocol. And let me give you a little bit of data. The optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been around and entered into force in 1976. It has 114 parties. So a lot of countries of the world have accepted the jurisdiction of the civil and political body to adjudicate private complaints against the countries that are parties to that covenant and decide whether there have been violations of rights. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether those decisions have any real teeth to them. Are they enforceable? No. Can you take them to court? Maybe. Do countries honor them? Some do, some don't. But I think that's true with a lot of law. I think that's true with a lot of law, isn't it? So I'm not sure that's a killer argument to say, well, let's get rid of it. But if we look at the covenant, the optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it was adopted in 2008. Finally, it has not yet entered into force. It now has 39 signatures of those 160 countries. And 4 countries have ratified it. It needs 10 to enter into force. So as soon as the 10th country signs on, those 10 countries can start complaining to the treaty body about violations against those countries. And are they big countries? No, they're not so big, not big international players. The difference in the way that the enforcement of these treaties is seen internationally is probably most marked by the distinction between those 2 optional protocols and the way that individuals can complain under the treaty mechanism. Now, there are obligations. Every country that signs on to a treaty has an obligation to submit a periodic report saying, this is what we're doing in our country to comply with this treaty. And the treaty body reviews those reports, says, thank you, we appreciate your submission. We'd love it if you would do a little bit more with this and a little bit more with that. Sad that you're not doing this. Great that you're doing that. Mostly they say that. They do very little of, geez, we really like you to do a lot more. It's very diplomatic. These are state representatives talking to state representatives. Don't want to be too mean to them. They might come back and bite you when it's your turn to come up in front of the committee. So you don't want to be too critical. It's all very nice diplomacy. Let me take a question. You had a question?
I was curious if a country under the Inter-American Court could bring a petitioner with a right to food.
Yeah, great question. Anybody know the answer? Right to food?
I think you can.
You can?
You can. I thought.
How would you do it?
Well, I don't know how. I just remember seeing a case where I think they were petitioning or saying that the state of Ecuador was not providing food via a public school case, something like that.
And your memory was that there was some decision that said they
Well,
do have an obligation to provide food?
No, I know they can bring it. I don't know if they'll.
Whether they win. Yeah, I think that's a more complicated question. It's a great question. There's actually a treaty on economic, social, and cultural rights within the regional system of the Americas, the Protocol of San Salvador, which is the equivalent of this treaty at the regional level. Sadly, it only has a couple of provisions that are capable of adjudication. But very creative lawyers have figured out ways to raise issues about economic, social, and cultural rights by alleging violations of civil and political rights that will invoke the claim that they want to get to that has to do with economic, social, and cultural rights. Example, let's take this one. If kids in Ecuador don't have equal access to food in the schools, some kids get it, some kids don't. Use the equal protection provision of the civil and political covenant to argue deprivation of the right to food under an equality principle. So there are ways that lawyers have always come up with. I mean, we have these doctrines of incorporation in the U.S. Constitution. The treaty regime has the same kind of stuff. Ways to draw one principle from one body of law into another to be able to argue that a particular right is capable of being adjudicated and decided. Now, I'm going to do just a couple more points and then open the floor for questions. Hey, everybody, people have to run the class at 1? Some do? You don't? That's great. Well, but I will shoot to try to make sure we address all the basic issues here. There are strong myths about these treaty regimes, the two of them together. And I've already mentioned one, the positive and negative sort of polarity that gets oftentimes invoked, that I think is a false dichotomy. Another one is that these are not rights at all, but aspirations. These are hopes. And the best evidence evidence of that is they're so slippery. You know, you don't really have to meet them, and there are all kinds of qualifiers. So they're not really rights. They're only rights if you can get them right now. If they're to the maximum of their available resources, with a view to achieving progressively, to take steps, they aren't really rights. They're aspirations. That argument has been made over and over and over by the United States in the UN. We see these as aspirations. We have signed this treaty, but not ratified. The Obama administration, they're okay on it. I actually looked up a speech by Michael Posner, the human rights guy in the State Department these days, and he says the following with regard to U.S. obligations and issues about economic, social, and cultural rights. He says, we will be guided, we the government in the United States will be guided by the following 5 considerations. First, economic, social, and cultural rights addressed in UN resolutions. Notice he avoids treaties. Resolutions are different than treaties. Should be expressly set forth or reasonably derived from the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, even though we're not a party to it. While the United States is not a party to the covenant, he says, as a signatory, we are committed to not defeating the object and purpose of the treaty. He's right. That's the legal principle. Nice of him to say it out loud. Second, we will only endorse language that reaffirms progressive realization of these rights and prohibits discrimination. I like that. Progressive realization is the notion adopted by the treaty committee that says you can't retrogress. Even though there are all these qualifiers, you still got to keep moving forward towards realization. You can't ever drop back. And discrimination is what we were just talking about. Right to equal protection for all people for these rights. Third, language about enforcement must be compatible with our domestic and constitutional framework. That's his bone to the conservatives who say there isn't any right to food or any of these others in the Constitution, so forget about litigating it. Fourth, we will highlight the U.S. policy of providing food, housing, medicine, and other basic requirements to people in need. And fifth, we will emphasize the interdependence of all rights and recognize the need for accountability and transparency in their implementation through democratic participation of the people. Nice words. They are from a speech made at the American Society of International Law in March of this year. Does he argue that the U.S. should ratify the treaty? No, it's nowhere there. Is that something they're going to be likely to do? No. Would this be something we would want to be pushing in Congress these days? I should think it would be an uphill battle. Don't you think? I mean, we are getting enough trouble with jobs bills, let alone huge international covenants that create international obligations. So there are those qualifications. It also sometimes is argued that economic, social, and cultural rights are second-generation rights. The first generation is civil and political. The second is economic, social, and cultural. I dislike the distinction. I think both treaties were adopted at the same time. It's an effort by those who would denigrate the quality and content of the rights to sort of a second-tier level. And I think this notion of an integrated vision that the Universal Declaration has, that Franklin Roosevelt invoked when he talked about the 4 freedoms, that included freedom from want, which was his one-word summary of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant 70 years ago. Freedom from want was the way that he tried to capture that during the Great Depression. And he recognized that we have an obligation to meet those needs of everybody in the United States. So they are not, in my view, second generation. They're important and on a co-equal plane. And lastly, that they are not justiciable. And I've suggested a number of reasons why it's harder than hell to adjudicate these cases. But does that mean you can't? Anybody know cases involving economic, social, and cultural rights? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a good case in South Africa where they used the equality and non-discrimination to achieve right to education for children with intellectual disability.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Why does that happen? Do you have any idea that why is South Africa doing this?
South Africa, they have a pretty progressive constitutional court, and they have a pretty, they have economic and social and cultural rights in their constitution.
You got it. You got it. The post-apartheid constitution, very progressive, and the constitutional court that's interpreting it, very progressive. So first case in South Africa is health. Then there's a housing case. This one on education.
Yes, last year.
Last year. There is a parade of amazing, beautiful cases from South Africa on economic, social, and cultural rights. I commend them to you. You won't find analysis like this in anything in our courts. Remarkably, they're more than happy to use case law from the United States in analyzing their cases. Tell me the last time you saw a South African case cited by the Supreme Court in our country. I don't think it happens. Some of that has to do with sort of the dignity of the office and the political power the United States has to not invoke those sources, right? Or at least the perceived dignity. So, other countries? Know of other countries where there's activism going on in the economic, social, and cultural right? Go for it.
There's a couple. There's a series of really good case law in India around the rights of life, actually, because even though they don't have economic and social and cultural in the Constitution, the right to life has been construed to include the right to food, for example.
Absolutely. They've actually used the right to life to incorporate almost the whole panoply of economic, social, and cultural rights, because they basically said the right to life includes all of these basic necessities that you have to have in order to live. So India is another great example. Another country. Colombia is one, not the university, but the country, is another country that has had an active jurisprudence. It hasn't been translated so much, so you won't find it so much in English yet, but they've been another very adventurous country with economic, social, and cultural rights. And they tend to be countries where there is either a period of transition or a period of, or massive issues about economic, social, and cultural rights that get presented to the courts over and over and over again, and they just have to take them on. So they finally do. And I think those are great lessons for us, great examples for us in the United States when we think about economic, social, and cultural rights here. Let me take some questions. Anybody got a question? Not a single one? Yes.
Before you mentioned that any countries that are parties to these treaties, I guess, write reports to demonstrate how they're experiencing it. I'm just wondering, like, who writes those reports and how much fact-checking goes into them and how much weight give to those reports.
Yeah. Well, your last phrase suggests you have an answer to the first part of your question.
Well, I don't know.
But you're speculating, and your speculation is right. It is the country itself, so its own mechanisms within the country. Oftentimes, the State Department or its equivalent in those countries is writing the report. Lawyers for the government write the reports, and they're oftentimes a little shady. They aren't so complete. So there's a growing practice of so-called shadow reports, reports submitted by NGOs and other concerned citizens who read these reports and say, that's not how it is. We're going to write a report that says the real picture, and we're going to submit it as a shadow to this main report to tell the committee what's really going on. And there's really a cottage industry in this. There is this universal periodic, what's it called? The periodic, Andrew, what's it called? Periodic review. Anyway, it's
Universal periodic review.
there you go. Universal periodic review. See, I said it out loud. I just didn't put it together. Where all countries in the Human Rights Council of the UN are required to submit reports about their general compliance with human rights, all treaties that they have ratified. And the U.S. went through that process last year. Quite an active number of submissions from law school academics and others. Terrific. I mean, those are easy to find if you want to take a look at what U.S. scholars said about the U.S. report. The U.S. report is actually not bad. I was on a panel with somebody from the Obama administration who presented the report in the Universal Periodic Review process for the United States, and she was not defensive. She said, we got a long way to go. We're doing some good things. We do some very good things in the U.S., but we make mistakes. We don't do all of our obligations. It was the best possible way that she could pitch this to the audience she had in front of her, who were NGOs that were pretty skeptical about any government's submissions to the UN. But
don't you think it's a lot easier for the U.S. to come out and do an answer like that than
absolutely,
other countries?
absolutely.
So I
The
guess
U.S. can basically say whatever it wants to say. Nobody's gonna tell them no.
An honest answer, but
Right?
an easy answer too.
It is. It is. And you know what? It didn't save her from serious attack. I mean, she took the brunt of a lot of questions that were very pointed and I thought very accurate. Particularly another panelist who spoke on economic, social, and cultural rights in the United States and just sliced and diced her on that issue. So she sat and smiled gracefully and listened. But it was a great other panel. I really liked the other panel. Didn't spare anything. Yeah.
I just have a question regarding the justiciability of progressive regulation, because that's something that the government is always taking steps and can always show that it has a certain plan, but when it's too slow, a violation of that obligation. And it would just be nice if, I don't know if you have some good examples of how creative lawyers have done that to show that this is not fast enough for a violation.
Again, it's a great question. It's sort of the moving target nature of these rights. Do they change in their content because they're being progressively realized? Can you ever stop them in litigation? And does the government always have the defense that says, well, we're on the way, we're progressively realizing, we're getting there, you just got to be patient. It's going to happen next year, or the year after that, or the year. So actually the litigation tends not to focus on that issue. There are a lot of lawyer writings about the way these clauses should be read together to create core content to rights. And there is actually on the website of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, they've defined the core content of a number of rights and said, below this, you're not meeting the basic obligation. And oftentimes that's what's involved in the litigation, is that core content. It's that failure to meet the most fundamental aspect of the right in question. Last question.
I wonder which has been the reaction of the Americans about this non-willing to sign treaties by the different governments, which has been I don't know, movements about that.
Are you talking about the United States failure to sign?
Yeah.
Well, there have been discussions in every administration since the Carter administration about human rights. And it really was then that human rights came into the forefront. It was he and his State Department that pushed human rights. It was during his administration that this treaty was signed in 1977. And yet there is a process of ratification in the Senate that we have to go through that involves debate and adoption by a certain percentage of the Senate.
In every country.
And in every country. I mean, every country has a version of that.
Yeah.
And the United States has been not so good. Not so good in the sense that we have ratified some of the treaties at the international level. We have ratified the Civil and Political Covenant, the Race Covenant, the Torture Convention, the Genocide Convention. Others? Not many. The Children's Convention has been ratified by every country of the world except the United States and Somalia. Not good company. A failed state. And the United States isn't likely to sign or ratify that treaty at any time in the future. So, I mean, the criticism of the United States, I think, is well-founded by many countries that say, well, you're having us comply with human rights, but look at yourselves first.
But internally, in level of like citizens, what citizens?
At the citizen level, I don't think there's much knowledge about it. I would guess for many of you, this is the first time you've heard about the treaty or talked about the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Am I right? And have you ever heard of it before you came into the room today? It may make it into the news very rarely, but talking about treaties is fairly sophisticated stuff. As soon as the treaties come up for ratification, if we put them into the Senate for a process of public debate, then we have Fox News and the right ginning up the machine to make the arguments the most vitriolic attacks they could make that would argue against the ratification of the treaty. True with the Women's Convention when it was last in play. True with the Kids Convention. Kids will be able to divorce their parents if we adopt this treaty. All kinds of wild arguments. And certainly the same with the Women's Convention. Around the same kinds of arguments that have been made around the adoption of an equal rights amendment for women's rights in the United States in general as a constitutional amendment. So the popular knowledge about human rights treaties is fairly low in the United States, and there's not much of a populist movement. There are a few centers around the United States and a growing number of NGOs and popular movements that have invoked human rights as the sort of lexicon of what they're trying to argue. And they're invoking those provisions as ways to raise consciousness and bring about popular momentum to causes on the street. But it's few and far between. Yeah, did you have a question? Okay. I think we're going to stop there, and I thank you very much for coming.